I'm Franklin Robinson Jr., and I'm the historian in the family. I work at the Smithsonian Institution in the Archive Center, so this has always been a very great interest to me, and I'm just glad to see this getting off the mark. So I just want to welcome you to Serenity Farm. If you don't have a brochure, take one. We do farm tours and especially children's tours and that sort of thing, so we would welcome you, and anytime, truly, just let us know you're coming, and you're welcome to come and look at the farm and tool around, and all we ask is that you let us know you're coming. That's the only thing. So thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are very fortunate to have people like this guy right here, because I've been working with him for a long time, and he knows a lot, and he's willing to share it. And that's not true of all scholars. I think scholars that are here will admit that.
Take a walk, will you?
This is the kind of guy who shares his information. But he's invited us all to come down and enjoy his personal property here, which is very nice. So we thank you.
Oh, my family invited. Welcome.
Well, a little bit of history about this area. It's chock full of history. But related to the War of 1812, I think when you guys did your little circle route through the town, you got to see some of the interpretive difficulties down there, because right now there's nothing, but there's a whole lot of potential there. And the problem that we have is, where do we do that and how do we do it? And we're very fortunate we've got two people from Charles County who will stay a little bit here in a couple of minutes. But first, let's talk a little bit about the history. So the first thing I wanted you all to make sure that you're aware of is that when we came across the bridge, when we hit the land, that is not where the British landed. That's where the bridge was constructed. But originally the ferry that came across here went right down to the old town site. So when we went into town and you saw the water on the left-hand side, that's where the British landed, right in through there. So what I'd like you to try to imagine is go back to August 19 and August 20, 1814, and imagine that there's over 25 British vessels anchored out here. Some of them are troop transports, some of them are frigates, and others are much smaller, like schooners and all kinds of barges and whatnot. And they're running soldiers back and forth from the troop ships to land here at Benedict. Imagine what it must have been like for the people that were living in the community there at that time. What did they think was going to happen? They had no idea. Imagine if you were one of the British sailors or one of the Marines, and you had been on board these ships coming across the Atlantic, and you had been on board for so many weeks that you weren't really even able to exercise your legs. So one of the first things that these guys did when they hit the beach is they went through euphoria. They were taking sand and throwing it up in the air. They were rolling around on the grass. They were just happy and delighted because they finally were off of those goddamn boats. They were on terra firma for the first time. But then they realized, well, guess what? Now we've got a hike from down there to where their encampment was going to be located. And there's a little bit of a discrepancy, and I kind of mentioned that this morning. If you look at the engineer maps, they show that the British were encamped right on the top of these heights, essentially where we are, all the way to the road, and even a little bit on the other side of the road. And even if you read one of the accounts, it says, our little army was encamped on top of the heights. But if you read most of the other accounts, it says that they were all down here at the base of the heights. So who's right? It's possible that both of them are right. It's possible that maybe this was more of the pickets, the people who were making sure that there was not going to be any enemy approach coming from the west. Maybe the main encampment was down here. I have no idea. We're talking about possibly trying to do some archaeological investigation to ground truth exactly where the encampment might have been. Until that's done, we have no idea. But what we do know is that the cannon that they had, which were very small cannon, would have been mounted at the height of the road. So when we were coming up the road and we turned into Serenity Farm, if you looked continued up to the height of that road, that's where the British cannon would have been located. And that was to control the road. The cannon wouldn't have been pointing down in this direction. The cannon were pointing to the west. They were defending an American approach from the west. And then all along these heights they would have had pickets. And some of these pickets went even beyond where we are here. Some of the pickets went further to the west so that they could be like scouts that could detect potential movement and report it back to the main British line that was here. So there was all kinds of occupation all through these heights, and probably the main encampment, as far as we know, was right down in this area. So imagine over 4,000 British soldiers camped in this particular area. It took them a day to get them here. Parts of the 19th and parts of the 20th. By about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, in the heat of the day, the height of the heat of the day, they began their march to continue further up that hill to go to their next encampment, which was at Patuxent City. And I showed you again an engineering drawing of that. They had actually hoped to go further, but they only made it about 6 or 7 miles because of the heat. So imagine what kind of uniforms were you wearing? What was it made of? What were you carrying on your back? You were carrying your musket, you were carrying ammunition, you were carrying gunpowder, you were carrying blankets. Some of the men would have been carrying things like concrete rockets. Some of the men would have literally been hauling cannon that were on wheels. And most of those were actually sailors that did most of that kind of work because they were familiar with the kind of rigging and whatnot that was needed to do that kind of stuff. These men were exhausted. Some of the reports were that so many men were exhausted that they lost all sense of a true army marching up the hill. There were people collapsed on the side of the roads, people resting. There was no organization. The regiments had lost all formation. Their first night at Patuxent City, a thunderstorm comes through. These men did not have tents. So all of them are soaking wet. And there's one account by this fellow that I think all of us love, Don and I in particular, by the name of Klieg or Plague, however you want to pronounce his name. But during the thunderstorm, he describes in his diary a passage where the lightning strikes and he could see the flash of light go through the encampment, and he could see the light coming off of all of the bayonets, of all of the muskets that had been set up throughout the encampment. And when you read things like that, to me, it just kind of brings it alive. And yet, if you go up there today, you have no sense at all that there could have ever been a British encampment there. So that's what it was like back then. But you know, the citizens of Benedict had some familiarity with the British because prior to the landing, as you remember, we talked about it this morning, there were 2 other engagements that took place here. There was the one on June the 16th, and that's where the British came ashore, 160 British soldiers, along with 30 Colonial Corps members. Now, what is the Colonial Corps?
Free black soldiers.
Exactly. Free black soldiers. These were primarily African Americans who either escaped on their own and went to the British side or were freed by the British when they went and raided some of these different plantations and whatnot. And they were given an opportunity, if they chose, to fight on the side of the British. And they were trained at Tangier Island. They were given uniforms. All of their officers would have been white. The irony of that is that 30 of them landed right here at Benedict in the War of 1812. Well, what happened in here during the American Civil War? Almost the same thing, because we had Camp Stanton. And Camp Stanton was a Union camp where they went out and recruited African Americans who were slaves on all of the farms, not only around here, but also on the eastern shore. And they even went down to the mouth of the Patuxent River, near where we were this morning at Solomon's, and went on board the oyster dredge boats and pulled African Americans off the oyster dredge boats and brought them back here to train them to fight the Confederates during the Civil War. So almost the same kind of thing was going on between the 2 wars. And I don't want to get too far afield, but one of the things that Don kind of mentioned upon is the lack of unity, even though that was one of the goals that Bill was talking about for the Bicentennial. The Marylanders were very much divided over the war. But what a lot of people don't realize is that America was divided over the war. In fact, it was the closest official vote to declare war ever in the history of the United States. And the other thing that's amazing to me is that by the end of the war, the New England states were looking to completely pull away from the United States. They were so disgruntled about the whole thing, and they were very heavily suffering because they weren't able to do trade, which they were primarily doing up in the New Orleans states with England, that they wanted to pull away from the rest of the United States. And isn't it ironic that in the American Civil War, it's just the opposite. It was the southern states that pulled away. But it shows you that these differences were already there in the makeup of all of these